I never really liked small flights, but it was the only way to reach the remote destination I planned to visit. The plane, a simple model with a handful of seats, seemed reliable enough. Takeoff was smooth, and the view from above was breathtaking, endless forests and mountains that seemed to touch the sky. But that tranquility didn't last long. About an hour into the flight, the plane began to shake violently. The emergency lights came on, and the pilot announced, in a tense voice, that we'd have to make an emergency landing due to a mechanical failure. The impact was smoother than I expected but still terrifying. The plane landed in a clearing in the middle of a dense forest. We all stumbled out, dazed but relieved to be alive. There were only 7 of us, including the pilot. The forest around us was dark, with towering trees that barely let any sunlight through. The pilot tried using the radio to call for help, but there was no signal. We were left with what little we had, an emergency kit with water and some packets of crackers, and decided to spend the night in the clearing, hoping rescue would find us. When night fell, the temperature plummeted. We built an improvised fire, and the group huddled around it, trying to stay positive. But the darkness beyond the circle of light was suffocating. It was during the first hours of the night that we heard the first scream. It was distant but loud enough to send chills down our spines. It sounded human, but there was something wrong with it, an unnatural, distorted tone. "It's probably just some animal," the pilot said, trying to reassure us. But no one seemed convinced. As the hours passed, the screams became more frequent and closer. The forest, once silent, now felt alive with sounds we couldn't identify. Shadows began to appear among the trees, moving too quickly to make sense. One of the passengers, Clara, started panicking. "There's something out there," she kept saying. The pilot tried to keep the group calm, but the tension was palpable. I couldn't take my eyes off the darkness, certain that something was watching us. An argument broke out in the middle of the night. Some thought we should stick together and wait for rescue. Others, like Clara, believed it was safer to try and leave before it was too late. The division created an air of paranoia. Every little noise seemed to confirm that something terrible was about to happen. When a more distinct shadow passed near the fire, causing the flames to flicker, 2 passengers decided they wouldn't stay. They grabbed whatever they could carry and disappeared into the forest, despite our warnings about the danger. After they left, silence returned, but it was a heavy, unsettling silence, as if the forest was holding its breath. It wasn't long before we heard a blood-curdling scream from far away. It was one of the passengers who had left. The scream was followed by another, this time from Clara. Before anyone could react, we saw a figure moving among the trees, tall and thin, with movements that didn't seem human. The pilot stood, trying to grab a flashlight, but something crossed the clearing at incredible speed and knocked him down. Panic erupted. We scattered across the clearing, each of us trying to hide from whatever was stalking us. I crawled under the plane, holding my breath as I heard heavy footsteps and scratching against the fuselage. I couldn't see what it was, but the smell was overpowering and putrid, like rotting flesh. The sounds went on for hours, until suddenly, everything went quiet. When the sun began to rise, we emerged from our hiding spots. Of the original group, only 4 of us remained. There was no sign of the pilot or the passengers who had left. The clearing was silent, but the scratches on the trees and the ground left no doubt that what had happened was real. We decided we couldn't wait for rescue any longer and started walking through the forest, following a nearby river. To this day, I don't know what surrounded us that night, but I know I'll never step onto a small plane again without remembering the screams and those shadows moving among the trees. I've always been a fan of adventures, but not the conventional kind. My idea of exploring a remote area was to rent a small boat and navigate a river in a rarely traveled region. That day, the sky was overcast, but the river's calm water drew me in. With a simple motor and a printed map, I set off alone, eager to embrace the peace and isolation. For a while, everything went as planned. The hum of the motor, the soft breeze, and the distant calls of birds created a perfect soundtrack. But the tranquility didn't last. Midway through the journey, without warning, the motor died. I tried restarting it several times, but it only sputtered dryly in response. I looked around, no other boats in sight, just the river and banks that seemed to stretch further into the distance. I grabbed my phone, but as I feared, there was no signal. With little else to do, I let the boat drift with the current, hoping it would eventually take me to a busier area. Instead, the scenery began to change. The riverbanks grew darker, lined with gnarled trees casting eerie shadows on the water. Dense vegetation gave way to a swamp, with roots jutting out of the ground like claws trying to snare the boat. That's when I noticed something odd. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it soon became clear, there was something in the water, just a few meters away. A dark shadow moved slowly, always keeping a fixed distance. It seemed to be following me. At first, I tried to brush it off. It's probably a large fish or a log caught in the current, I told myself. But at every bend in the river, the shadow stayed there, moving deliberately, never too close, but never letting me out of sight. My breathing grew heavier, and the silence around me felt suffocating. The hum of insects and the calls of birds had vanished, leaving only the faint sound of water lapping against the boat. Suddenly, the boat jerked, as if it had struck something. I looked down, but the water was too murky to see anything. Gripping the paddle tightly, I prepared to push away whatever was there. Before I could act, the boat rocked again, harder this time. It felt like something was testing me, taunting me. My heart pounded as I began paddling with all my strength, desperate to escape that part of the river. As I paddled, the boat felt heavier, as if something was pulling it back. I glanced over my shoulder and, for a brief moment, saw something break the surface of the water. It was a slender form with long arms and thin fingers that grazed the edge of the boat. I couldn't make out a face, only a silhouette that seemed to grow larger as I tried to flee. I screamed, but my voice echoed unanswered. The sensation of being watched was unbearable, and on instinct, I slammed the paddle into the water with all my might. The shadow vanished for a moment, but the silence that followed felt like a warning, it wasn't over. With no other option, I kept paddling, sweat dripping down my face and my hands trembling on the paddle. After what felt like hours, I spotted a small light in the distance, like the glint of a lantern. I used the last of my strength to row toward it. When I finally arrived, I saw it was a group of fishermen, their faces a mix of surprise and caution as they noticed me in such a remote area. I stammered, trying to explain what had happened, but they only shook their heads silently. One of them finally spoke, "You're lucky you made it out of that part of the river. They say it doesn't like visitors." To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that swamp, but I've never stepped into a boat alone again. Every time I see a shadow in the water, my heart races. And whenever I think about that day, one question haunts me: what would have happened if I hadn't found those fishermen in time? It was supposed to be a simple weekend hike, just me and my two friends, Mark and Sarah, exploring a well-known natural park. The day started out perfect, sunny skies, a gentle breeze, and a trail promising breathtaking views. We spent most of the time snapping photos of towering trees and a gorgeous waterfall we stumbled upon. Between laughter and striking silly poses, we didn't notice how far we had strayed from the marked trail. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. We'll just backtrack, I thought. But the park was much larger than we anticipated, and soon we were surrounded by dense forest, with no cell service or sense of direction. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the golden light gave way to creeping shadows that seemed to stretch forever. That's when Mark noticed something odd on the ground, large, deep footprints pressed into the damp soil. They weren't from boots, and they certainly didn't belong to any animal we could identify. Sarah tried to stay logical, maybe it's from a large animal, like a bear or something. But according to the guide we'd spoken to earlier, there were no bears in this park. The longer we looked at the tracks, the stranger they seemed, like someone had walked on their tiptoes, with long, clawed toes leaving unnervingly deep impressions. We tried retracing our steps, but the footprints seemed to follow us, always appearing ahead as if they were guiding, or stalking, us. Then, through the dense vegetation, we spotted something completely out of place, a wooden cabin. It sat there, nestled in the trees, like it had been forgotten by time. The structure was dilapidated, with rotting boards and shattered windows, but its door was slightly ajar, almost as if it were inviting us inside. We hesitated. The sun was nearly gone, and the idea of spending the night in the open forest was even more terrifying than the cabin itself. Stepping inside, we found the interior even stranger. Dust-covered furniture sat neglected, deep claw marks ran along the walls, and the air was thick with the sickly sweet stench of decay. In the center of the floor was a circle drawn in charcoal, surrounded by strange symbols none of us could understand. Mark chuckled nervously, trying to break the tension. Looks like someone with too much time on their hands was here. But neither Sarah nor I could laugh. There was something about the cabin, something alive, watching us. Deciding it was safest to stay together, we settled into one room. Sarah turned on her flashlight while Mark and I stacked furniture against the door, a makeshift barricade. None of us could sleep. The silence outside was punctuated by sporadic noises, soft footsteps just beyond the cabin walls, always distant yet unnervingly constant. At one point, a faint scratching sound came from the door, followed by a low, guttural chuckle. Mark rushed to the window to look out but saw only the inky blackness of the forest. The night dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. The air inside the cabin grew heavy, almost suffocating. Then Sarah noticed it. The charcoal circle on the floor looked different. The lines were sharper, darker, as if they had been retraced. The air around it seemed to shimmer faintly, like heat rising off pavement. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. But when we moved to the door, it wouldn't budge. We pushed and pulled with all our strength, but it felt like something, or someone, on the other side was holding it shut. The footsteps outside started again, this time closer, and it was clear there wasn't just one set. Multiple somethings were circling the cabin. Just as the first rays of morning light began filtering through the cracks in the cabin's walls, the sound stopped. The door, previously immovable, swung open effortlessly. We didn't think twice. We ran. We didn't know where we were going, only that we needed to get as far from that place as possible. Hours later, exhausted and shaken, we stumbled upon a group of park rangers. Relief washed over us as we told them about the cabin. One of the rangers frowned. "There's no cabin in that area," he said, his tone laced with confusion. To this day, we have no explanation for what we encountered, the footprints, the noises, the symbols, or that eerie cabin. But one thing is certain, none of us have returned to that park, and the sound of those footsteps still echoes in my mind every time I close my eyes. I was driving to a secluded ski resort nestled in the mountains, excited for a peaceful weekend getaway. The journey started smoothly, with scenic views and a sense of tranquility. But as the snow began falling harder than predicted, the postcard-perfect scenery quickly turned into a white abyss. The road was blanketed with snow, visibility dropped to near zero, and my car started to skid. Before I knew it, I was completely alone, stranded on a snow-covered road, my gas gauge inching toward empty. I turned off the heater to conserve fuel and sat there, unsure of my next move. After hours of no cell signal and the cold creeping in, I realized I couldn't just sit there. Grabbing a water bottle and a few biscuits from my backpack, I decided to venture out on foot in search of help. The snow was heavy, muffling every sound, and the towering trees around me seemed like silent sentinels. I walked with no clear direction, hoping to stumble upon a house or shelter. That's when I saw it, a cabin emerging through the storm. The structure was old, its dark wooden frame sagging under the weight of the snow. I approached cautiously and pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the cabin looked untouched for years, dust-covered furniture, a wood-burning stove, and a few wooden chairs scattered around. The air felt strange, heavy with an unshakable unease, but the idea of a roof over my head was too comforting to ignore. I closed the door behind me and began exploring. The cabin had a small living area, a bedroom, and a tiny kitchen. Everything seemed abandoned, yet there was something unsettling about the place. As I worked to light the wood stove, I noticed something odd. One of the chairs in the living room was out of place. It was angled toward the door, though I hadn't noticed it like that when I first came in. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe I'd bumped it without realizing. As I unpacked my bag, readying for the night, a sound broke the silence, a faint scraping noise coming from the bedroom. My heart raced as I stood frozen, trying to rationalize it. Gathering my courage, I grabbed my flashlight and approached the slightly ajar bedroom door. Pushing it open, the beam of light revealed a dusty bed and an old wardrobe. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I exhaled in relief and turned to leave, but the sound came again, this time from inside the wardrobe. Fear gripped me, but curiosity won. I yanked the wardrobe door open, only to find it filled with old clothes, hanging and covered in layers of dust. Yet the air inside was wrong, thick with a damp, metallic smell that made my stomach churn. I returned to the living room, determined to ignore my growing paranoia. As I sat near the stove, I heard footsteps crunching through the snow outside. Slow, deliberate steps, heading straight for the cabin. My body went cold, not from the weather, but from fear. I quickly extinguished my flashlight and crouched behind the sofa, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped at the door, and then came the sound of scratching, long, deliberate strokes against the wooden surface. My chest tightened as the door, which I had shut securely, began to creak open. In the dim light, a figure stepped inside. It was impossible to tell if it was human. Tall and gaunt, its movements were erratic, jerky, as if its limbs didn't quite work right. I stayed frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears, as it shuffled closer to the sofa. It stopped mere feet away, its heavy, uneven breaths filling the room. I could feel it sniffing the air, searching. I clenched my fists, every muscle in my body tense, willing myself not to move. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly backed away, turned, and disappeared into the blizzard. The moment it was gone, I didn't waste a second. Grabbing my backpack, I bolted out of the cabin, running in the opposite direction. The storm was relentless, but fear and adrenaline propelled me forward. Hours later, I stumbled onto a cleared road where a rescue team was patrolling. Gasping for air, I tried to explain what had happened, but they looked at me with disbelief. I've never returned to that cabin, or anywhere so remote. Even now, the sight of snow stretching into the horizon brings back the sound of those nails scratching the door and the vision of that unnatural figure. Whatever it was, it's a memory I'll carry with me forever, and a reminder to never underestimate the isolation of the wilderness. I needed time away from everything, and when I saw advertisements for a small, secluded town promising tranquility and a deep connection with nature, I knew it was the perfect destination for my vacation. The photos showed empty streets, charming houses, and idyllic landscapes. It seemed like paradise for someone like me, who only wanted silence and peace. However, when I arrived, I quickly realized the pictures didn't tell the full story. The town had a strange atmosphere, almost deserted. The streets were eerily quiet, and the few open shops seemed devoid of customers. At first, I thought it was just the off-season, but the emptiness gnawed at me. The houses had thick curtains that blocked any view inside, and the few people I did see hurried by, avoiding eye contact. When I went to the town's lone grocery store to pick up supplies, the clerk, an old and gaunt man, gave me a look I couldn't decipher, somewhere between pity and warning. "You shouldn't stay here too long," he said softly as he bagged my items. I brushed it off as the typical rudeness of a small-town local, but his words lingered. That night, I was startled awake by a noise outside the small inn where I was staying. Looking out the window, I saw a figure standing motionless under the dim glow of a street lamp. At first, I thought it was just someone passing by, but they didn't move. I watched for a few minutes, trying to make sense of it, but then, slowly, the figure turned its head as if it knew I was watching. I quickly shut the curtains, my heart pounding. Something about this town wasn't right. The next day, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The streets were as silent as ever, and even when I passed houses or businesses, I felt unseen eyes watching me from behind closed curtains. At one intersection, I noticed a low wall covered with missing person flyers. There were at least a dozen photos, all recent. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to dismiss it as mere coincidence. However, when I returned to the inn later, I saw one of the faces from the flyers now pinned to a tree right outside where I was staying. When I mentioned it to the innkeeper, a young man with a quiet and nervous demeanor, he simply gave me a blank look and murmured, "Don't go out at night." I asked what he meant, but he just shook his head and refused to elaborate. That night, I locked the door to my room and forced myself to go to bed early. Yet, in the dead of night, I was awakened by faint tapping at the window. I remembered I was on the second floor, where no one should be able to reach. Trembling, I peeked through the curtain and saw handprints on the outside of the glass, but no one was there. The next morning, I decided it was time to leave. As I packed my belongings, I heard footsteps outside my room. Looking through the peephole, I saw an empty corridor. When I finally stepped out, the innkeeper handed me a folded piece of paper. I opened it quickly to find a single sentence: "They don't let anyone leave." I pretended to ignore it, but every passing minute in that town made me feel more exposed. I got into my car and started driving, determined to escape. Yet, as I navigated the streets, I realized something unsettling: the road seemed to change. The way out wasn't where it should have been. Every turn brought me back to the same spot, right in front of the inn. Finally, after what felt like hours, I found a road that seemed like an exit. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and felt my stomach drop. The figure I had seen under the street lamp that first night was standing in the middle of the road, watching as I drove away. Even now, far from that town, I can't shake the feeling that it isn't over. Every night, I sense eyes on me, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known again.